Okay, so you were just providing a recap of the product offsite and some of the questions or eyebrows that arose, or I guess kids that flew down some stairs about the policy roadmap for security orchestration, and I guess maybe some overlap or concern about compliance and maybe other groups. Is that right?
Correct. So I just wanted to give, just to start this off, I wanted to give a recap of what our roadmap is currently, and just make sure that we're fully aligned around what that is and how it relates to compliance and where we're working together, and make sure that there's no, that we're fully complementary uh, in everywhere we can be. So
Yeah, sounds good.
let me share my screen. I've got a lot of details on our direction page, but I don't necessarily expect you to read all of that. The short summary is that we're trying to provide both an alert dashboard and a policy UI to let users manage their security policies and their security alerts. So on the alert dashboard side, we're collaborating with Sarah. We're actually using all of the backend monitor team code, but implementing it on the front end so it's specific for security alerts, as opposed to the alerts that show up now. There are centered around like CPU and memory, usage errors, things that a NOC would take on rather than a SOC. So that's kind of where we're segmenting between the two of us there on the alert dashboard side. And then on the policy side, we actually have some policy UI now, but we're planning to add that out to support scans. The most salient and most near term of these are scan execution policies and scan results policies, where scan execution policies govern when a scan is run, and then scan results policies govern what's done after that scan is complete and has presumably either found some findings or not. And we want to do this for all of the different scanners. So we get kind of this big matrix of things that we want to take on. And we want to do this not only at the project level, but at the group. And I know there is no instance object, but we want to provide a way to apply these settings to your entire GitLab instance across all of the groups that you own as well. So we do have a rough prototype of this. The idea is that this would be a new navigation item in the security and compliance nav area. So you would come here, you're going to get a list of the policies that you've set up. This particular view is on the project level, but we are going to replicate it for the other areas as well. And depending on where things go with what Melissa's looking at with workspaces, we're hoping that this is more of like a build it once and then just slightly tweak it for group and instance, rather than building the whole thing from scratch 3 times over. So in here, you would be able to create a new policy, and this is really the salient part of the mock. So you would be able to set like a scan execution policy that says, if a pipeline is run, say against the master branch, then I'm going to require DAST scans to run with this configuration, scan A or scan B. So that configuration is stored in the database for DAST today. And this ultimately would generate a YAML file. So we do want to preserve like the infrastructure as code paradigm. So you would get the YAML representation of this policy, and you could optionally switch over into YAML mode and just edit the YAML directly, if that was more comfortable for you. So those two would be interchangeable in the same way that we've implemented this UI already for our container network policies. So we've got a lot of success with that. We want to extend that over to how you configure your scanners. You could also come in and schedule things on like a daily or weekly basis, depending on whatever you want to do here. And you could send yourself an alert or send a Slack notification saying, hey, a scan was kicked off. Your weekly job was kicked off, if you wanted to just keep tabs on it. So it's very flexible. You have this sort of generic if this, then that framework. And then on the scan results side, this is all about what happens when scans complete. So you could say, if any scan finds a critical vulnerability, I want to fail the pipeline, and I want to require approval, and I want to, also send an alert and a Slack notification. So you can kind of, get that same workflow, but customize it depending on, what you're looking at. If it's license compliance, maybe you're just looking for certain licenses that are showing up. At the end of the day, like, I see this as very complementary to what we're doing already. We are planning to move things out of the CI YAML file as much as we can and into the database. However, our current plans are not to replace the GitLab CI workflow. So users would still be able to configure it with their GitLab CI YAML file, but anything configured in this policy UI would take precedence. So it sort of, as you're parsing, as our GitLab runner is parsing the CI YAML file, it would basically pull it out, and then it would interject or overwrite, if you will, at the very end, anything that was configured here. So that way you have more segmentation of responsibilities. If the developers bork their GitLab CI YAML file or introduce weird after scripts that could potentially disable the scanning, this is going to come in and essentially override that so that it still runs anyway. And that policy is enforced. So that way, once you have a policy set up, you don't have to keep checking on that GitLab CI YAML file and say, hey, did anything change? Did anyone break it? No, it's going to work. If you set it up, it's going to work every time, no matter what's in that CI YAML file. So that way there's a little bit of separation of duties there. We would still let the developers view the policies, but the long-term vision, and this isn't going to happen immediately, but the long-term vision is that you would actually have a separate security approval workflow for changes to those policies outside of like your developer workflow, where you don't necessarily need a developer maintainer approving those changes. Instead, you need, a security personnel approving changes to your scan jobs and when they run. It is going to get a little bit dicey when we up level to group and instance, simply because some of the configuration settings need to be set at the project level. Like they're project specific, for example, like which SAST scanner you run, or for DAST, which URL you start the scanner against. But we are trying to do some research, and we're still thinking through exactly how that's going to work. But the idea is that you would still be able to say at a group level, I want DAST to run for all of the projects under it. And maybe for the projects under that, you would have like a default configuration or something like that it pulls in. So again, this would be complementary to the CI YAML file, but it would override anything that was there. And again, in the long term, because this is a new category, so we're just getting started, it's going to be a ways out before we're fully done. But we do want to leverage the immutable label work that you've done to, at the instance level, say, I want to only scan projects that are marked compliance, or that are marked, scan for SAST. And again, you don't want a developer to go and accidentally remove that label. So the immutable label thing works perfectly with that idea, where you could just write a policy that says at the project level, when a pipeline runs against the default branch for any project with the compliance label, then require SAST scans to run. And that way it's a one and done. Like, I configure this once, it applies to my entire instance. And if I've got 1,400 projects out there, I don't have to go into each one individually and constantly check up on it. So that's where we're headed. That's our roadmap. I've probably talked too much, but is that consistent with what you expected? Is that different? How does that align with your current plans?
Yeah, thanks for all of that. That's really helpful. I think you and I had talked about that before. So I think my opinion is the same, and that I agree. I think it's complementary. I think the biggest overlap is probably going to be with the work that we're doing on the forced includes alternative solution. But even in that sense, I see this as maybe like the future state of it, where what we're shipping now gets a broader, more holistic solution to customers now. And then that buys time to then work on what you've outlined here, which I think could be a more intuitive, maybe easier, more versatile way with less configuration, maybe. So those are just kind of my initial thoughts. In terms of sort of the original catalyst for this discussion around the product leadership offsite, I don't see detrimental overlap or friction in any way. I think when you and I last spoke about it, my perspective was, yes, like do this thing that you're working on. I see a lot of value for it, especially or particularly for the security stakeholders. The compliance persona cares about it, but they're only going to care about it from the perspective of an auditor has asked me for a sample of these scans, or an auditor has asked me to see some time frame in which we can show that we ran these scans on changes to production. So what we're building in the compliance dashboard would maybe use some of the data that's output by these scans, maybe a summation of the policies that are defined, that kind of thing. But I don't think that they're redundant efforts by any means.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I believe last time we talked, I don't remember the use cases that you brought up at the time, but I think you mentioned there were other use cases that were solved for with the forced includes outside of just when does a scan run. And so I think it absolutely makes sense to have both, definitely in the short term and probably even into the long run, because we won't necessarily be addressing all compliance use cases with what we're building in our UI.
Yeah, the other use cases for posterity on this recording are things like complex or proprietary business systems or documentation or reporting type tasks that have to occur for each change. I know Sid's opinion is, hey, let's do that stuff natively, and some of it we can and are doing now. But that still won't convince an organization to offload entirely these complex systems and workflows that they have. So we're trying to pull some of it out with things like API-based approval rules on the merge request, but then there's stuff that has to happen after the merge request is merged. That's still part of that auditor compliance program. I think scanning is one of them, because scanning, some organizations have said that they do it both during the that build and merge window, but they also do it after the fact to make sure that there hasn't been any changes or something unaccounted for, is just sort of that like risk averse double check. So yeah, so I think it's fine. I don't think there's overlap. I think at some point, like in maybe a year and a half or more, all things remaining the same, we might have to circle back and say, okay, now how do we unify this experience at some point so that we don't have two very different dashboards, which are ultimately benefiting the organization in that security compliance umbrella? And maybe that's still okay, but I suspect we might have to unify it at some point. I mean, but that's far off, especially as we start evolving these features.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, right now, as far as dashboarding goes, like, some use cases that we're not really showing today are that we're not tackling are answering questions like when were scans last run. We're not, my category anyway is not delving into dashboarding. I know Matt's got his vulnerability dashboard, but I'm focused just on, managing security alerts and security policies. And so, if from a compliance perspective, you wanted to get like a report of when were all the projects last scanned, right? That would be outside of where we're tackling anyway. So I agree, 100% on board with you. I view these things as very complementary. I don't think there's a huge amount of overlap. I think there are areas where we'll be able to jointly leverage what each other is doing. Probably the nearest term one is, us leveraging the forced labels or the immutable labels work that you've been doing will probably be the earliest thing. But yeah, timing wise, it's a brand new category. It's going to be a while before we've got a lot of substance there anyway. So we'll circle up and we'll certainly stay in touch and continue that collaboration as it evolves, because, maybe more touch points in the future.
And just to I don't know, wave away that horse, because I don't want to use a violent term, but just to pet that horse, I think that's the exact perfect example of we have an open issue to see, I think it's a project security grade or something. Like we just want to take that high level data. And so the other data point would be, when was it last scanned? And I know that was something that had Sid's interest as well, as far as customer feedback and just being a high level data point that's important. So yeah, exactly what you said. We will end up taking some of that data and complementing the compliance dashboard and vice versa. So sounds good to me.